What's happening? Well, if you are watching this video, then chances are you have found yourself completely enamored with these neo-retro motorcycles, and who can blame you? I mean, they're combining the awesome styling of the early 70s to early 80s hot rods with modern technology and modern power output, but what are they really like to ride? Is it just skin deep, or is there a lot more substance to these things? Well, let's sit down and chat about it. Well, I'm pleased to say that with the Z900 RS Cafe, the awesome is not just skin deep. This is a great performing motorcycle. And what I want to talk about when it comes to this motorcycle is some of the things that I've seen on riding videos. They're critiquing the bike in an odd way. And to me, it's like they're telling me good news like it's bad news. So what I want to do is I want to talk through some of the points on this bike that I personally found to be really more endearing than I thought that I would find them to be, especially with this bike. So let's jump in the middle of this. One of the very first things that you'll hear if you've watched these other riding videos is that this bike has a very snappy throttle. It's more like on and off or something along those lines. Absolutely not the case. Maybe it was the case for an early model or maybe an early run lot, but let me just tell you this bike doesn't have an on-off throttle. It's got snappy throttle response. I mean, listen, it's got snappy throttle response in an old school hot rod kind of way. And it has that kind of throttle response in a way that is not really four-cylinder-esque. It runs a lot like a really well put together, well-tuned three-cylinder. Put it to you like this. If you've ever ridden a Triumph Daytona T595 with a good TOR tune, that real snappy throttle response, like this one has right here, that is very similar to the riding experience that you would have with the Z900 RS. It has a very crisp, very quick throttle, and it's very much in the same guise as the RC51 or really any of the hot rodded V-twins that were out back in the day. It is very much in lockstep with that. So by telling me that this thing has like an on-off switch somewhere along the way for the throttle, I think they're missing the point. These are folks that have never ridden the motorcycles from back in the day that are extremely, by their standards, twitchy. I'm saying that they're extremely reactive when it comes to the throttle, and I absolutely love that. So if you're a fan of old school hot rods just in that respect alone, and it's something that you've missed, this girl behind me gives it to you in a way that you haven't experienced in a long time. Now, the other thing that they will tell you is that the suspension is too soft. This is kind of a strange thing for me because suspension tuning and engine tuning are very slippery, slopey, if you will. I'll tell you what, give me some room and I'll explain to you what I mean. Okay, so the suspension is set up to be more street oriented. That's not to say that it is soft. It's just a bit more street oriented if you are to compare it to a true pure sports bike, like something along the lines of a GSXR 750, or pick something that is more race track oriented. This bike is for the streets, y'all. It's not a race bike, so it's gonna be a bit more compliant. Now, you can upgrade the spring pack and the shock package if you like, but the reality is that where this bike excels is at doing really fun street bike things. And just by looking at it, it would kind of give you the impression that, or at least the look would tell you, oh man, that's maybe a street bruiser type of a bike, like a stoplight to stoplight hot rod. That's where you would want maybe a little bit softer suspension to help transfer that power and get it to hook. Guys, that's what this bike does really well, is have really good power throughout the mid-range. Now, I will be honest and I'll tell you this. My bike is still going through break-in, so I'm not really hammering on the bike, but I am riding it. You'll vary your loads and things like that with the break-in procedure, so it'll give you a bit of a taste of what that bike can deliver. And guys, I can tell you this, the mid-range roll-on punch and push is really, really nice with this bike. And I think that even though folks will tell you that well, the power delivery is a certain way, they always go back and start talking about the suspension, kind of like I did just there. Guys, the suspension is just fine. Set your preload and you'll be a-okay, but factory is just fine. And guys, me kitted out with a helmet, I'm exactly 200 pounds, if that gives you any indication as far as what I feel like with this bike. Now, anything other than, factory components, if you're going to start adding, modifications and things like that, you can set this bike up for whatever you want. But again, I'm just talking about from the factory. And guys, I got to tell you, I really like this bike a lot, just the way it's set up from the factory. Now, let's talk about the engine a little bit. What's the performance specifications of this thing? What kind of power are we looking at here? Well, I got to tell you, the published number for horsepower is not out there, but it's listed. It is published at 73 foot-pounds of torque. Horsepower is somewhere between 110 and 115 at the flywheel, depending on who you want to talk to, because these bikes will typically lay down somewhere just shy of 100 horsepower, say 95-ish horsepower. Some dynos have them up a little bit more towards 100. Yeah, dynos are a little bit different. Some are more generous than others. But the reality is that, it fits right in there with that sort of 115-ish horsepower. Just call that right there. The thing is, though, is the way that this bike puts down the power, the horsepower number is almost an irrelevant number with this bike. Granted, again, I'm still going through break-in, but I can tell you that I have got thousands of miles on that T595. Again, it is also roughly the same displacement as my Z900 RS Cafe, but they have very similar tip-in throttle response and throttle reactions. Remember when I was telling you about really snappy throttles and throttle response? Well, that Daytona's got it like you would not believe. I mean, it's kind of the poster child for tip-in throttle response. The Cowie is incredibly close to that. So rest assured, if you're looking for a bike that is going to be snappy on the street, this is the bike that's going to get you there. And realistically, where you're going to be riding this thing, say in the 4 to 7,000 RPM range, this thing is going to be ideal. And it's flickable too. This kind of has something to do with the suspension and with the engine output, kind of how they marry together. Rolling into the throttle, even as you are kind of weaving in and out of moving chicanes, aka traffic, this thing is incredibly responsive. It's flickable as you're rolling into the throttle, and you can just kind of point and click with this bike in ways that you might not be able to do with a more sports-oriented package. So in general, what it feels like to ride is a very well sorted out street bike. It's not trying to be a race bike. In fact, it may be able to do really well on a track provided you put some time and effort into suspension setup and different components. But the real mission statement of this bike really is not that. This bike is for the streets, having a blast. Again, that stoplight to stoplight drag strip, this bike is going to be pretty hard to deal with because the power is so manageable, the clutch is so smooth. You can really roll into the throttle and roll off of that clutch and have this bike accelerating a lot harder than what you might expect. I have a feeling it might surprise you if you get a chance to ride one of these things. And in saying all of that, it's not the only Neo Retro out there that I've ridden. I've ridden the Thruxton RS, and that bike has a lot of the same endearing qualities that this Kawasaki Z900 RS Cafe has. And they're both cafe-inspired bikes. They both have very good torque, and they both look amazing. So, in saying that, there's other bikes to compare it to. I just haven't ridden those bikes. I want to tell you this, though. If you're thinking about picking up one of these bikes and you're kind of getting yourself caught up in specifications and weights and all this other stuff, guys, don't worry so much about that. They all weigh basically about the same, wet and ready to ride, full of gas and fluids, somewhere around 475 pounds. The reality is, in terms of gearing and everything else, every engine's going to have its own power band and its own area where it excels at and then gives up a little bit and compromises to another engine configuration. You need to try these out. I will be bringing to you some more content with this bike versus another bike. Kind of have the two bikes sitting next to each other. I can tell you my experience with this bike versus the other, but I just wanted to focus on this bike, my personal bike, and give you guys my first initial impressions of riding this bike, because I bought this bike before I had ever ridden it. I had signed the paperwork, signed on the dotted line, dotted all the I's, and did everything else I needed to do with this bike, and had never fired it up myself. Just because I loved the way that it looked. I figured it's got plenty of power. I saw the torque figure. What can be wrong with 73 foot-pounds of torque? And if it looks like that, I know that it's going to run good. And in fact, it exceeded my expectations in several ways. So hopefully that helps you out, guys. Post up your comments, let me know what you think, and I'll catch y'all on the next one. That's a wrap.